Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic, and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders, and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
Hi, and welcome to Bespoken Bones, ancestors at the crossroads of sex, magic, and science. We are healing trauma, connecting with our roots, and developing radiant erotic wellness in past, present, and future generations. And I'm your host, Pavini Moray, and today it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Seth Eisen. Seth is a San Francisco-based artist, creating a hybrid of live performance and visual media as a vehicle to broaden human perspectives and effect social change. And he performed as a member of the Butoh companies Harupin Ha and Inkboat from 1994 to 1999. And from 2000 to 2010, he toured with Keith Hennessy and Circo Zero across the US and Europe. His solo performances and installation projects have been featured in the San Francisco Bay Area, at the Oakland Museum of California, Yerba Buena Center, as well as being presented in art spaces on both coasts. And for the past 20 years, Seth has staged performance pieces, street spectacles, and installations, and appeared in a number of collaborative productions created with other Bay Area artists. In 2007, Seth founded Eisen Presents, a theater company that promotes social change by linking queer history and aesthetics to contemporary queer culture. The company's productions have focused on recovering the lost history of queer ancestors whose lives have been erased from the historical records. Eisen creates live theater that protects and promotes LGBTQ history through rigorous research, transdisciplinary performance, and community-building events in San Francisco that unearth and elevate queer ancestors, illuminating the life stories of unsung queer heroes. The organization artistically recaptures LGBTQ stories and traditions erased from the records to create a lasting body of evidence and to disseminate these vital legacies for future generations. Their productions in gender and aesthetic that experimentally blends performative and visual disciplines, puppetry, and live drawing, fused with contemporary dance, drag, live music, physical theater, and video. Seth, so good to have you here on Bespoken Bones. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure.
I am so excited about this new piece that you are premiering on March 10th in San Francisco. It's called Out of Sight, and I would just love if you would introduce the show to us a little bit.
Sure. So this is a kind of a dream project, and it came about a year and a half ago when I read this historic context statement that the city of San Francisco was putting together with two researchers, Donna Graves and Shane Watson. And this was a larger project that was put together from, believe it or not, the National Park Service created an initiative to help cities create a historic context statement that would help to contextualize queer sites and lost queer histories as part of the fabric of our American culture. And they use San Francisco and Los Angeles and New York as test cities. And through that funding, they created this amazing document, Donna and Shane did, that's available online on the city planning website, San Francisco City Planning website. And I can give you the links for it. It's really quite incredible. But in the study, they talk about all of these histories dating back to prehistory and the Ohlone people, and go forward into, 18th and 19th centuries, and then early 20th century, etc. And I was just so inspired by thinking about how we could represent some of these histories. Most of them I hadn't heard of yet. And so we spent about a year of immersive research working in the archives of the GLBT Historical Society archives, as well as the public library archives and several other archives. And we applied for a grant with the Creative Work Fund, and they funded us to work in collaboration with an organization called Shaping San Francisco, which actually has an archive online, as well as which includes a lot of queer histories as well. And so they were kind of a perfect organization to partner with. They do walking and biking tours around the city. And this project is all about working in different neighborhoods of San Francisco, starting out with North Beach and then moving to the Tenderloin. And we hope to do other neighborhoods as well to bring to the fore histories that are mostly unknown. I mean, there's lots of histories, as you know, that that people know about, but there's lots and lots that we found really fascinating that we're bringing to life. So the project is a queer history walking tour, and we'll be taking people on a 2-hour walking tour that will both feature the characters that we've developed through our research, as well as them being situated in the places where those histories were located.
That's really exciting. And I know that it's happening in 2 parts, at least right now. You have this part that's premiering March 10th. And then you have another part that's premiering in May. So folks can have a lot of different chances to come and participate in the various parts of the walking tour. I'm curious of why queer ancestors. I came to your work through seeing your production of Homophile, and I'm going to circle back to that later in the interview. But it's obviously the center of my work as well. But why queer ancestors when there's so many other topics? How does this speak to you personally?
Wow, that's a beautiful question. I guess it started for me about 25 years ago when I first started reading about Two-Spirit culture. And as you probably know, probably many of your listeners know, that there were more than 150 Native American tribes that held a very special role for people who didn't fit neatly into the gender binary. And many believed that, those people were more closely linked to the Great Spirit because they were androgynous or, had a flow in their gender. And so I was very inspired by that in my early studies of it and of Two-Spirit culture, and became involved and went to these events that were called the Naraya, which are still happening around the country, and by this Two-Spirit person named Clyde Hall, who lived in the Bay Area for a long time, and he restarted what was once known as the Ghost Dance, and renamed it as the Dance of All People, bringing all peoples together, and including queer people. And so I was very inspired by his work and by the work of different historians and researchers that were trying to recover some of those histories. But also it was just really an affirmation that we were valued in other cultures. And I really felt it was my calling to make work about my ancestors and my queer ancestors. And I wanted to see if I could, through my creative practice, make work that was kind of a calling out to them.
I love that. It's interesting that you mentioned Clyde Hall and the Naraya, because the way I come to this work, to centering my work around queer and trans ancestors, is through a calling that I got several years ago at Wolf Creek Radical Fairy Sanctuary in Oregon, which is where one of the Narayas is held. I have not attended that Naraya, but I know that that one is held in particular for folks of gender blessed experience. Yeah.
Yeah, this is, it happened, going to Naraya happened much later in my study. but it's really an incredible ritual to participate in if you ever have the opportunity and hear the call. I highly recommend it to your listeners to go to one of them. They happen all over the country, and they're all year long.
I'm curious about your personal experience of connecting with queer ancestors through your art practice.
Well, it started out really early on, performance-wise. When I was a student at Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado, and some of my professors were, they had turned me on to the writings of Two-Spirit folks. And, I started really, I think the first piece I really did was through my work there, through performance. Earlier on, I was working a lot with spirit and prayer and ritual through my visual art. I was trained earlier as a visual artist, and spent a good part of my early creative practice working as a visual artist, both painting, drawing, doing collage, making books, and those kinds of things. And then I went to school for theater and dance, and it's kind of a long history. But I think that the first thing that really sort of set it in place for me was a piece. It's not the only thing, because as I said, 25 years ago, I did that very first piece, and that was like a performance piece where it was trying to incorporate some of the storytelling of different Two-Spirit peoples. But then fast forward to my work with Keith and Circo Zero. Keith and I were in France in the early 2000s, and we were making a piece that was called How to Die. And it was about kind of bringing together the history of sort of the epidemic of crystal meth that was happening in the Bay Area at a really rampant pace, and also connecting that with the history of queer people who had who had died from AIDS over 25 years. And I think that anniversary was part of what the piece was about. And in the piece, Keith asked me if I would play the ghost of Sylvester, the international disco diva. And I, of course, was delighted that I was going to get to play Sylvester, despite the fact that I'm a hairy, white, Jewish guy, figuring out how to represent somebody, of another race, and also just honor their spirit. And in that piece, I got to do a lot of research on Sylvester, and it was the first time that I really ever fully connected with an ancestor, a queer ancestor, where I got to really go very deeply into his history and realize that this was something that I really loved to do, like conjure and bring forward his spirit and make something for him in honor of him, and do something that people would both get to know who he was, what he contributed, and also why it was so special to us and how it could help us move forward as queer people. So that's kind of how it got started, was with that piece, How to Die. And in the piece, I'm just giving a lot of detail about it just because it was so special to me, of being able to represent Sylvester in that piece. We worked with another musician, this guy, Jules Beckman, who was kind of my live backup band. And, I performed Sylvester's songs, but I was kind of like this ghost of the past, who was kind of helping people remember that AIDS actually happened, and that some of it was because of maybe our sort of cultural amnesia, that at the current moment, back in the early 2000s, that people were forgetting that we had been through this, pandemic, and were really kind of connecting our queer ancestors who had died of AIDS with what was happening currently in the queer scene.
That's helpful. I'm curious, you said that you made the piece for Sylvester, right? And I'm just curious about, I think of art as an offering. When we make art, we're offering it out into the world. We're offering it to the people who have the experience of it. And it sounds like you were making an offering to Sylvester in this case. And my question is about the queer dead, and how do you believe that they are served through these projects?
Well, I don't know if I can really answer that. I don't know that they specifically are served, but it's a really interesting question. I definitely feel some rapport, like back and forth with ancestors. I mean, I have a whole ancestor practice myself that I've had much of my adult life, where I'm talking to my own blood lineage ancestors. And I think that's kind of where it got started. My queer ancestor practice, and with my blood relatives, I feel their responsiveness. With queer ancestors, I feel more that it's a calling out to them, and also kind of creating a space to bring their wisdom and their work and their words creatively into a non-ritual space through performance, which is actually ritual space as far as I'm concerned. But to do that, and then in a way, I feel like we are sort of receiving their blessing, and there is a kind of dialogue that's happening. But I don't know that it's necessarily, as I see it, a real dialogue where they're like talking through me or talking to me. But I will say that in many instances, I definitely feel them, and I have definitely had cast members tell me that they feel the energies of them, and I've had many different things happen through the work where I feel them communicating with me, and I'm able to make choices and decisions around the creative work that feels closely linked to what they instructed me. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm wondering how you know those messages. Is it through dreams, or how does the information arrive for you?
I'll give you a specific example. In the last piece that I made, it was about the life of my mentor, Remy Charlap. He was a gay artist who was born in 1929. He died in 2012. And he was actually one of my first instructors at Naropa University. And when I moved here to California, he said, "Oh, look me up and we should get together," that kind of thing. And so I did, and we became fast friends. And he both mentored me as a performer and as a visual artist and as a teacher. And he had a stroke in 2006, and I became one of his primary caregivers. And then he needed someone to kind of go through his archives, and I helped catalog all of his archives. He was a dancer with the Merce Cunningham Dance Company, and he was a very big part of the avant-garde, which was a lot of queer people in the 40s and 50s and 60s in New York City before moving here to the Bay Area. And he was also a very celebrated children's book author. His books were Fortunately and Arm in Arm were two of his most popular books. And so I got tasked with working with his archives and helping move them to a studio where they are currently stored. And I asked the executors of his estate when I was making the piece about him if I could work in the archives for about 6 months to a year, which I did. And it was a very spiritual process of like going through his journals and, reading and learning more about him that I actually knew as his friend about him, and a lot of intimate stuff. And it got to the point in the process where I knew a lot about Remy as a young person, as like a young man, and I knew a lot about Remy as an older man, but I didn't know much about him as a middle-aged man. And at the time, I was thinking that there'd be 3 characters in the show: one who would represent him as a child or a young man before he went to art school, and one who represented him as a kind of ailing older man in his 80s. But I didn't really have the full picture of that person who was middle-aged, and I had no one to ask, really. So one night I went to his archives, and I invited my research assistant to come along with me. It was a really late night, and I kind of just like called out to him. And I said, "Remy, can you just help me? I really want to find this piece of you that was your middle-aged self that could both speak to your younger self and speak to your older self." And so I stated it really clearly, and I reached into a box of his journals, and we pulled out a journal randomly and opened it up randomly to a page. And I swear to you that what was in there was a drawing of himself as the old man. And on his lap was the young boy of himself and the middle-aged man of himself. And then there was 2 pages of writing about this kind of middle self of the younger self that could speak to the older man, and the older man who could ask the younger self questions, and the middle-aged self who could look in both directions, who could look to his future, to his older self, and back to his younger self. And I would say that was, kind of an epiphany, both with that project, but also that that I know that that in a way I feel very connected to the ancestors, and doing this kind of work I feel gives me a really exquisite opportunity to be in touch with folks that make it possible for me to do the work that I'm doing, and to make the voices of queer people and queer ancestors much more prominent than I have known them to be. I didn't have those kinds of mentors when I was a young person, and I wanted to make sure as an artist that it was much more possible for queer people of all ages to be able to hear those voices very clearly through this work. So that's my answer.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the specific example. It's helpful, I think, to just hear what people's experiences are of like, how do we know the ancestors? How do we feel them? How do we hear them? Kind of what are the ways that they show up? Because it can be easy to not turn our attention in that direction, right? And so that practice of that muscle, I guess, that gets built of listening, of asking, like you said, I asked out loud, and then you were available to receive the information as it came, right? It's beautiful divination practice, I would say. Yeah. I'm curious, we both are tending similar cultural threads, you and I. And I want to ask about the ways that you think, and I think you just kind of briefly started to touch on it, when you said having an available resource for young queers to turn to. But I'd love to hear more about how you find your work in service to cultural healing. And before I do that, I want to tell you a story. I was working with a client in my sex therapy practice, and this person was an older gay male who was having a lot of shame around one of his erotic behaviors, which was gathering images of nude men and curating them. And, I listened to that and I was thinking about it. And I mean, for me, there's, it was just beautiful. It was just a beautiful practice. It wasn't anything shameful, but for this person, he was really experiencing a lot of shame around it. And I had seen your show Homophile a few years prior to this, in which Samuel Stewart is it's rich, and you could speak way more to it than I can. But what I remember is that he's categorizing his sexual encounters and writing them on index cards of each time he has an encounter. He curates it. He's keeping a file, the Homophile of these encounters. And that was the image that came into my mind as this client was talking about this. And so I told him, I said, "Oh, have you seen this show, or have you heard anything about it? Do you know anything about Samuel Stewart?" And he said, "No." And he went home and did research about it. And that is one, in particular way, I see this work of bringing these stories to light as a piece of cultural healing, of a way that this work does trickle out and supports the healing of living queers. And I just wonder if you have anything that you'd like to say about cultural healing here.
I'm loving your questions. And I also just want to apologize to the listeners too about my flu, which is why my voice is a little bit ailing. I feel that the work that I'm doing is very much about cultural healing, to, for queer people. And I do really like, I love that you see the alignment between the work that we're doing, because I think you're one of the first people that I feel like I have that first person that, really has acknowledged that. Mostly it gets seen in the context of, performance or dance or, theater making or visual art, but often doesn't get seen, in a way of, what is it doing spiritually? How is it helpful as a cultural healing? And I feel like there's just so much to be healed. And I'm glad you mentioned this thing about the shame, because people like Sam Stewart, who were in times that were far less open and free than the times we're living in now. Although I know for many people, for many of us, it's still a big struggle to be fully ourselves and to not have shame, especially around sexuality and our queer eroticism. And that's why the show about Sam Stewart was very special. For me, I was actually going through a lot of healing around my own sexuality while I was making that piece. I was doing some recovery work from being sexually abused as a kid by multiple people, both family members, teachers, and I was kidnapped once by somebody in the neighborhood. And I'm mentioning that because those things were really assaults to me, both as a sexual person and as a queer person. And I wanted to. I had always felt a bit of sadness that I was not more like sort of sexually free, in my history. And this work I was doing around my sexual abuse recovery was really helping me to kind of come to terms again with healing myself sexually around those histories, but also to confront, with Sam Stewart, someone who, despite the fact of, being shamed because of his sexuality, was, making, these cards that were, keeping track of all of his sexual exploits from the age of 16 until he was in his early 80s. And eventually those became public. Of course, at the time he created them, he was doing them, in hiding, and they were all done in code so that if anyone found them, they wouldn't be able to understand the code without the key. And so I think it really spoke a lot to how, we as queer people often have to be in hiding or have chosen to be in hiding because of, the shame around our sexual practices, and instead of having so much pride about them as I think we should. And so the work around Sam Stewart was a big bridge for me. And a real epiphany happened for me was when I interviewed a friend of Sam Stewart's. I'm not going to mention who this was, but it was really a major turning point in the making of the piece. And that person told me, this is like probably happened in the 70s, that they had this encounter. It was here in the Bay Area after Sam had moved here. He moved to the Bay Area in the early 60s. And so he had this friend, and his friend, came to him as someone like, Sam being someone who was so sexually free and was having a ton of sex and, writing all of these, encounters down and being very open about them, and also, writing about them, drawing about them in his erotic work as a pornographer. And so this friend, said, I'm really hung up about sex, and I don't know what to do about it. And Sam asked him, he said, did something happen to you when you were younger? And the guy came out and he said, yeah, my uncle sexually abused me and I never really did anything about it. And he said, I want you to work on that. And I want you to go and I want you to confront him, and I want you to confront your other family members about it. I want you to go bring a bottle of wine to your aunt, who was, I think, the wife of the uncle who had sexually abused him. And I think the uncle had already passed away. And so he did what Sam said, and he went and he confronted the aunt, and, this big sort of family secret came out. And the man received a tremendous blessing from Sam because of that. And he was able to really recover from the challenges that he had in his sexual life, and has been so much better ever since doing that, and his guidance from Sam. So I wanted to bring that to the personal level to around cultural healing, because I made that piece so that about Sam Stewart, so that people could see the trajectory of someone who, was growing up in a time where it was, very, very challenging for queer people to be out in any way. And, as I said, despite that, he, really traveled, a lot of territory, both from, being kind of really outspoken and hiding, but not so much, is, his sexual tastes and his exploits. And also I think that came from being mentored by Alfred Kinsey and also Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas, who I saw in the piece as really his kind of queer ancestral parents. And, you know, Kinsey encouraged him a lot to continue to explore his sexuality, to keep records of it. And he really saw Sam as a sexologist, you know. And Gertrude Stein, the writer, you know, encouraged Sam to write about his experiences, both sexual and non-sexual. And, you know, later in life, he figured out a way to bring those things together through his erotic writing. So I feel like exposing the trajectory of these different people's histories is a way that I'm able to do service to with queer ancestors and with our own cultural healing about queer culture and the both spiritual and artistic tools that we have as queer people to be able to offer the larger culture, but also to heal ourselves. So that's my answer.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it just also, what you're saying really speaks to this truism, which is trauma is everybody's problem, right? It's not just the person who is stuck holding the bag on whatever oppression or trauma that person is facing. It's such a bigger cultural issue, and you know, as queer folks, it's the healing isn't going to come from. There's not going to be like top-down healing, right? It's going to come from within marginalized community. It's our responsibility to find our own modes of healing and heal ourselves. And that, of course, ripples out and brings more goodness and blessing to everyone as we step into our healing and our power of being able to do that. And so I'm just, you know, really wanting to say thank you to you, Seth, for doing that work, and to Sam Stewart and to his mentors and to all the other ones. Like, that's why we call it a lineage, right? That's because it's like there's this passing of responsibility that is actually to each one of us, right? It's our responsibility to pick it up in whatever ways we do. So thank you for that. I want to finish by asking you about the results that you've gotten. And I'm going to invite you into your woo, if you'd care to step in to just talk a little bit about, you know, as a result of these practices. You said you have had a personal ancestor practice for decades, and maybe for generations, but at least in your life for decades, and a practice with your queer ancestors for at least the last 20, 25 years. What have you seen in your own life, or kind of in the field as a result? Wow,
that's a big question. I don't know if I can answer it briefly, but I would say, well, my own ancestor practice, you know, is around altars, altar building, and being in regular contact with my ancestors, wearing emblems of them on my body, asking them for help, you know, asking for their assistance and their blessing around the work that I'm doing in my world, even despite the fact that I might not be exactly, you know, someone who they would necessarily be able to contextualize as a queer person. I've definitely felt their responsiveness to me through my work and through my life. In terms of queer ancestors, I definitely feel very held by my practice of creating this work around queer ancestors, and both through the connections with people that I make and seeing, like, you know, on a one-on-one level, it's really quite incredible to see the effect that this practice has on the performers. You know, like the people that I get to work with, and that they're actually representing these different ancestors, and now it's many people who I've been in this practice with. I'd love an opportunity to talk to you about the current show. I haven't really even said anything about the characters of this show, but just in previous shows, I think I mentioned that for my show Rainbow Logic, which you can read about on my website, and there's a blog on there as well at eisen.org. The actors that were performing, both the younger Remy, the older Remy, I know that their lives were incredibly touched by being able to represent those histories and the fact that they were so queer. In the Sam Stewart piece, I think the same is true. I mean, I had a couple different people play Sam Stewart because there were 2 iterations of that show, and both of them seemed, really blessed by being able to be part of that history, as well as the folks that played. I had an actor / drag queen who played both Gertrude Stein and Alfred Kinsey, and it was a dream role for him. He was a really excellent actor, and he just loved being able to play it, to play the Gertrude Stein in drag, and then also play, Alfred Kinsey. So in the current show, there's a ton of queer histories that we're bringing out. The ones I'm most excited about. Well, I'm excited about all of them, for different reasons. But I'm going to be more specific about the first tour in North Beach. But first of all, North Beach was this fertile ground, this fertile territory for all of this creative activity that happened in the 50s and 60s by, the Beats and so forth. But before that was actually the case, it was really queer people who inhabited the neighborhood, who had a little bit more freedom in that neighborhood to be themselves, and where some of the first and earliest gay bars were both in the Barbary Coast area and then all through North Beach, starting in the 20s and 30s. And so we're bringing back some of the lesbian bars from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, as well as some of the, more important gay bars, such as the Black Cat, where Jose Sarria, was the head queen. Some of the stories that I'm really excited about are the fact that this performer from New York, Gladys Bentley, came to this lesbian club called Mona's 440 and performed there, as well as 2 other local talents. One was this artist, Kay Scott, who was really just like a bar back, at Mona's club. And another one, Beverly Shaw, who was both here and in LA, who were singers. Both of them were singers, so we're kind of bringing those histories out in our Mona's scene. And then Gladys Bentley, who came to Mona's as a headliner to perform. So we're bringing all those histories out. Another history that I'm super excited about is this story about a 19th century trans man named Milton Matson. And he was this incredible man, originally from Australia and then to England, and then came to San Francisco in the late 19th century and was arrested and found to, be a bio woman, and was told by the police department of San Francisco that he could no longer live in the outside world as a man, even though he had been doing so for 26 years. And they said that, the deal that they would make with him was that if he agreed to dress in women's clothes on the street, that he could be an exhibit in a dime museum. And dime museum was a place where they would exhibit, both queer bodies and disabled bodies and people with it was sort of like a cabinet of curiosities for different people, where their curiosities would be on display. And so he worked at this dye museum and was engaged to be married to this woman, Ellen Fairweather. And so he performed as himself, Milton Matson, at this dye museum. And so in the show, we actually feature his story and his encounter with the police and his part of his act from the dye museum, which we bring back to life. One of the other really special things that we're getting to do in this particular project is really feature Two-Spirit culture. And we're working with the Queen Land O'Lakes, who's connected us with Two-Spirit community. And we're going to be on one of our tours having a Two-Spirit from the Ohlone tribe performing or doing ritual with us to sort of open up the tour for us, as well as Land O'Lakes themselves are going to be doing a ritual for all of the North Beach tours, which we're really excited about. And this will kind of bring the histories of the Ohlone people, and it gives an opportunity for our tour goers to be in ritual space together. We tried that out this past weekend, and it was just so compelling and beautiful to actually be in ritual space with folks.
So that's great. Thank you. It's been such an honor to have you here on Bespoken Bones today. Just wanting to let folks know that Out of Sight is premiering March 10th, 11th, 24th, and 25th in San Francisco. This is the LGBTQ performative walking tour through North Beach queer history that Seth has been referencing. And if you want more information, or if you want to buy tickets, which I highly recommend, you can check out his website, which is www.eisen.org. That's EYEZEN.org, eisen.org. And I want to thank you for listening to this episode of Bespoken Bones. And if you feel inspired by what you heard, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear what's going on as the shows are landing for you, what you're learning, what your questions are that you'd like to hear addressed on the show. You can use the contact form on bespokenbones.com to be in touch. And you can also go there to learn more about the sexual and ancestral wellness work that I offer. And I am Pavini Moray, and I will be back every full and new moon with more embodied goodness and ancestral wisdom. Blessings on you and on your ancestors.